Hello, welcome to your academy. At your academy today in this lecture, we will deal with the idea of realism, the concept of realism, and the process of abstraction by Karl Marx. This lecture is being recorded on demand. Uh, some of the viewer on YouTube asked to record this lecture. So, fulfilling the request, we have come up with this lecture on the concept, the idea of realism and the process of abstraction. We have recorded quite a good number of lectures on Marxism, whether it be about introduction to Marxism. We have discussed the writers like Raymond Williams, we have discussed the writers like Louis Althusser and others. Now, if you want to watch those lectures, you can visit your academy's homepage, go to the playlist section, and in the playlist section we have divided our lectures under different playlists. For example, in the section regarding Marxism, you will find the lectures on Marxism. In a general playlist which is dedicated to literary theory and criticism, you will find numerous lectures which cover the topics related to literary theory and criticism. Similarly, you can watch lectures on poetry, you can watch lectures on drama and novel and other that we have recorded or uploaded on your academy. If you have any topic that you want us to deliver a lecture upon, you can very well write in the comment section on any of the videos of your academy. We'll do our best to come back with a lecture on the said topic which perhaps you would have asked for. So today the topic is realism, critical realism, and the process of abstraction. Now, if you look upon this topic, there are two important words or two key terms which need to be understood in order to understand this whole concept of realism and abstraction. Those two words are realism and the abstraction, reality and the abstraction. So first up, we need to understand the meanings of these two words, and also we need to understand the context in which Karl Marx has used these words. Now, when it comes to the word realism, realism is about the reality, and Karl Marx used this word for the concrete reality, for the physical world, for the world which as it is that appears in front of us. Now, in the concrete reality, in the concrete realism, what we have includes everything that a human being can perceive, that a human being can understand, that a human being can see, that a human being can touch, that a human being can feel. Now, everything of that sort which exists in the world is for Marx real, or is the realism. Now, the abstraction would be a kind of the virtual form of this realism. Now, this virtual is not the exact word that perhaps Marx would like, but since in the contemporary times where we are much aware with the differences between the reality and the virtual things, so that is why I am using this word virtual to make it understand slightly better. So anything which is like reality but not the exact reality would be abstraction. And this word abstraction is derived from abstract here, which means to pull from. Now, if you understand this concept, this idea of pulling from, then you will understand the word that I used earlier, virtual. There is reality and there is virtual reality. From where does this virtual reality come? Obviously, it's an extracted, or it's pulled from this reality. So abstraction would be much like a similar kind of a concept, or idea which will be extracted, which will be pulled from what? From the reality. And this process of abstraction, what does the process of abstraction do? So Karl Marx says that the process of abstraction converts the concrete reality, or the real concrete, into the thought concrete, into the thought process. So this abstraction is basically converting the real world or the real experiences into the ideas, into the concepts, into the perception. So abstraction, the process of abstraction would be the process of thinking, the process of thought, the process of idea, the process that we want to reorganize, reshape, reconstruct, give names, that is, rename the existing reality. Now, why do we need the process of abstraction at the first place is important to understand. When Karl Marx was dealing with this whole concept of dialectics, with whole concept of historical materialism and abstraction, he had one thing in mind, and he would say that a lived experience, a real lived experience is one thing, but if you want to communicate that lived experience, that real experience, that concrete experience to someone, if you want to communicate that, now that process of communication of that one experience, of that one reality, goes through a process of abstraction. And in that process of abstraction, the things that become significant, are the things that become important, are the ideas of perception, are the ideas of conception, are the ideas of description, are the ideas of idealization of a particular thing. Because we have seen something, that means we have perceived something, we have experienced something, and then we want to convey it. Now that conveying process goes through a thought, goes through our mind. So this abstraction is basically a mental activity. The process of abstraction means or includes not the physical activity but the mental activity. Now again, in this mental activity, what happens, as Marx says, that when we talk about concrete reality, or the realism for that matter, as the world, the universe is in front of us. So he uses a very common term for it, that this concrete reality cannot be swallowed up. Swallowing is something, we cannot swallow stones, bricks. I am just giving an example. I don't think Marx was into it, that swallowing bricks and stones is a good idea, but we can't. So concrete is like that. When he uses the word swallow, he does not use the word swallow in the literal terms, but perhaps he is telling us that it could not be understood without going through that mental activity, without going through that abstraction, without going through that process of abstraction. So swallowing would not be eating up, but also understanding. So in order to understand this world, it has to go through a mental activity. And what does then this mental activity do? Or what does this abstraction, this process of abstraction, which actually is a mental activity, do? It first up perceives, conceive. So these are the ideas. For example, there is perception at the beginning, and this goes into conception, and then perhaps the communication. Now in this process of perception, conception, communication, Marx says that this abstraction process would rearrange, redefine, and organize the ideas, organize the experiences, organize the lived experiences. And in doing so, what happens basically is that we include certain things and we exclude certain things. Because if we are going through this process of abstraction, creating an abstract form of the reality, in that what we would do, we would use concepts, we would use terms, we would coin words. Now those words, those concepts, and then we would define those concepts, those words. I'll come in a little bit with an example of this whole process, but just this is the beginning, how I'm trying to explain this whole process to you. We give concepts, we give terms, and then we define those terms. Now, in giving those concepts, defining those concepts, we may end up at excluding some things and including some things, depending on our perception, depending upon our understanding of the things. This whole process of abstraction is a dynamic one, because there could be a time, for example, if a mental activity is going on regarding a particular thing, regarding a particular idea. At one point of time we may include something, at another point of time we may exclude something. Now, to give an example, that what happens when this idea of abstraction comes into being, and how do we pull things from the reality. I'll give you an example, that human society, our life is realism, is the concrete reality. And when a thinker tries to define, organize, explain those lived experiences through the process of abstraction, it becomes an ideology, it becomes a theory. So Marxism, as I am dealing with Marxism at this point of time, this concept of abstraction is from Karl Marx. Marxism is also an ideology, is a theory. So to understand this whole concept of abstraction through an example, Marxism is the abstraction of the real lived experiences of ours. So what Karl Marx did through this process of abstraction, through this mental activity, he pulled this theory out of the real concrete, out of the realism, out of our way of life, out of our society, and the ideas that he rearranged, he reconstructed, he organized, he concepted, or he gave terms. That's the abstraction process. So the abstract form of the human reality, of human society, in this context would be Marxism. Marxism is the abstraction of the reality, of the realism of our society, and that abstraction, that abstract form of the reality, that is Marxism, comes up with, for example, the concepts like base and superstructure, with the concepts like hegemony, with the concepts like historical materialism, with the concepts like class struggle, with the concepts like bourgeoisie and other things. Now this class struggle, everything, it's taking place where? In reality, in our society. But then the abstract form would be class consciousness. The abstract form would be class struggle. That the Marxism above all is the abstract form of the reality. So what does the process of abstraction do with the realism? It pulls the ideas from it, reorganizes, renames, redefines these things. So that is the process of abstraction. And you can now understand it in various perspectives. For example, colonization, which was very much prevalent in the 20th century, was a real lived experience. People, lived the colonization, the slavery of the colonization, the exploitation of the civilization, of the colonization, the oppression of the colonization, the destruction of the colonization. And then comes a thinker, and what he does, he creates an abstract form through the process of abstraction, and we have a theory called colonization. Now what does this colonization again do? It gives you the concepts, the ideas, the terms, self, other, east, west. You understand? And the binary divisions, and the natives, and the men, the word, hybridity, identity crisis, exploitation. These are the words then, come in front of us. Savage, civilized. Now this would be that abstraction of a reality which was lived by the human beings. So this is the process of abstraction. When it comes to the abstraction of Karl Marx, he uses this term abstraction in three different senses. Now I'll be explaining all those three different concepts or ideas of Karl Marx. The first sense, or in the first idea in which Karl Marx uses the term abstraction is first and the most important. It refers to the mental activity of subdividing the world into mental constructs with which we think about it. Now, in the first sense in which Karl Marx used was the sense which we have already discussed. It's about mental activity. It's about reorganizing our world. It's about subdividing our world, or our experiences, are the realities which we live. The second sense in which Marx uses the concept of abstraction is, it refers to the result of this process, the actual parts into which reality has been apportioned. That is to say, for Marx, as for Hegel before him, abstraction functions as a noun as well as a verb. The noun referring to what the verb has brought into being. In these senses, everyone can be said to abstract, that is verb, and to think with abstractions, that is noun. Now, this second sense, or second concept, if you want to just break it down, it could be slightly complex for you to understand, but let me make it very easy or simple for you. It deals with the result of this process, result of the abstraction. Now, result, before we reach to a certain result, there is an activity which is involved. That is why there are two grammatical terms being used, or parts of speech is being used here, and that is noun and verb. Now, since this process of abstraction is an activity, and since it is an activity, therefore it is a verb. Therefore it is a verb. It involves an act, an action, so it's a verb. And the end result which comes up becomes a name. That's a noun. Now, again, I will be giving the same example of Marxism. When Karl Marx was trying to abstract this reality and trying to give this theory called Marxism, right from the beginning till he was able to give us the concept of Marxism, he was going through an activity which was basically what? Verb. And then he gave a name, Marxism, which was a term that was coined. And later what happens, now people who think from this noun, that is Marxism, again enter into a process of abstraction. Now when you are reading Marxism, though you are not dealing with Marxism like perhaps Marx did, but if you look at this world from the Marxist perspective, now again you also enter into that verb, into that activity, but this time it comes from the noun, which was basically the end result. So one, that this abstraction used by Marxism was about the mental activity. Second, it was also about the end result, and that then end result again goes into that abstraction, goes into that verb, goes into that activity, and almost most of the people would now use this process of abstraction, whether you are dealing with colonization or post-colonial studies, whether you deal with feminism, whether you deal with Marxism. Now these would be different processes of our mental activities with which we see the world, though the real process of abstraction is always done by few men, and they are the philosophers, they are the thinkers. And then there is also a third sense or concept in which, or idea in which, Karl Marx uses the word abstraction, and that is, but Marx also uses abstraction in a third sense, where it refers to a suborder of particularly ill-fitting mental construct, whether because they are too narrow, take in too little, focus too exclusively on appearances, or are otherwise badly composed. These constructs do not allow an adequate grasp of their subject matter. Now this third concept, or this third sense in which Karl Marx has used the concept of abstraction, is the most complex to understand. But let me give you an understanding of this whole idea, this whole sense in which Karl Marx uses. And he has used some words, for example, badly composed, ill-fitting mental constructs. Now these are two things that you need to understand. Now what is an ill-fitting mental construct, or what is badly composed idea or construct or abstraction? Now here Karl Marx gives us an example of freedom. For example, there is a word called freedom. Democracy came up and it told us that you are free. Now freedom becomes, for that matter, a real lived experiences. I am free, you are free, everyone is free. Now when Marx was talking about this third sense of abstraction, he was basically talking about capitalism and the ideas or the realities that capitalism has come up. And one of the idea that capitalism has come up was freedom. They told us that everyone is free to choose, everyone is free to live, but then that freedom, says Marx, is abstraction. Now here this abstraction becomes a kind of a virtual thing which is not really experienced by the men. Now here what happens is, say for example, there is a laborer and he is free, say for example, to choose where he can work, where he can give his services. But when he enters into any particular kind of contact as a labor force, he loses the idea of freedom. Then he is not free. And in the capitalist system, what happens then is the exploitation of the labor. But the labor still believes that he is in a system which provides him the freedom. So this freedom itself, as a word which initially perhaps was a reality, becomes an abstract thing. So Marx says that all the realities that are lived under capitalism are basically abstract things, are abstractions. So which, to conclude this third idea, third sense of Marxism, we can say that any experience as in the sense of Karl Marx that is lived is basically an abstraction, is not real, is basically a virtual reality, is a kind of hyper reality. And this hyper reality was later best also explained by the people like Lyotard, by the people like Baudrillard, when they took to the postmodernism. And both, remember, Lyotard and Baudrillard and Frederick Jameson were highly influenced by Marxist ideas, and there are people who also associate these critics, these theorists, with the Marxism. So they would slightly change this idea of abstraction to the idea of hyperrealism. That is why at the very beginning, when I talked about this abstraction, I told you it's kind of a virtual reality, different, are pulled from the reality, attempted to be made real, but is not actually real, and is a virtual reality and is an abstraction. So that was the realism and the process of abstraction. So realism is the concrete world and abstraction is the thought world, is the world of thought, is the world of mental activity. The process of what process of abstraction does, it pulls things, concepts, ideas from what? From the concrete reality. Therefore, the process of abstraction is a mental activity which attempts or tries to reorganize, redefine, rename, conceptualize the reality lived by the human beings. Why do we do so? In order to comprehend, in order to communicate, in order to perceive the reality. Because as Marx said, that the concrete reality or the concrete world cannot be understood unless we organize it, unless we define it. Or what he said, that concrete reality cannot be swallowed, cannot be communicated. In order to communicate or swallow or understand it, we need to put a mental activity in place, which is what the process of abstraction is all about. I hope that this lecture was helpful for you and you were able to understand the realism and the process of abstraction by Karl Marx. That is all we have at your academy for today. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to share, like, comment and subscribe at your academy. For more interesting stuff, keep watching your academy.